The water beneath the water. Now, the old people said that every river carried two waters. The first was the water human beings could see, the brown current swirling between the cypress roots, carrying leaves, fish, broken branches, and whatever else the land surrendered after a rain. Beneath that flowed another water. It had no mud in it, no sunlight entered it. It flowed on directions unkept on any map. It moved beneath rivers, lakes, wells, and flooded forests, joining rivers separated by hundreds of miles. The little people lived here. Now, some call them the river kin. Others call them the children beneath the current. The oldest families along the Bayou simply call them the below folk, because speaking their true name near water was said to invite their attention. Now, they were smaller than human children, with copper brown skin that glimmered beneath the moonlight. Their tightly coiled hair floated above their heads even when they stood on dry land. Their eyes were large and dark and reflective, holding tiny points of light like stars trapped at the bottom of a well. They wore garments from the river grass, fish skin, flower lily fibers, and translucent wings of insects. Some had delicate fins along their arms. Others possessed thin, glass-like wings that remained folded against their backs while underwater and opened only when they rose into the night air. They were beautiful, but the old stories warned that beauty was not the same thing as kindness. The river kin healed wounded animals. They guided lost children toward the sound of familiar voices. They taught certain human healers where magical roots grew beneath the flooded soil. During terrible droughts, they brought hidden springs for communities that honored the water itself. But they also sank boats. They tangled nets around the hands of greedy fishermen. They led poachers into stretches of marsh that did not exist by daylight. A person who poisoned one of their sacred pools might hear singing outside of his home every night until he followed it into the darkness and disappeared. The law was simple. Take what the water offers. Never take what the water has chosen to keep. Elias Baptiste had heard these stories from his grandfather. He had simply stopped believing them. The fisherman. Elias had worked this bayou since he was 12 years old. He knew where the catfish rested beneath the submerged logs and where bass gathered where the water cooled. He could smell approaching rain before the clouds crossed the sun. He could read the circles appearing in the water and tell whether they came from insects, turtles, fish, or something much larger beneath the surface. His grandfather had taught him that fishing was not a battle between man and nature. "You ain't conquering nothing here," the old man would say. "The bayou was here before your name, and it'll be here after nobody remembers it." The first fish of every morning was therefore returned to the water. It was an acknowledgement that the fishermen had entered another nation's territory. But that year, the catches had become smaller. Then they stopped altogether. Elias spent entire mornings checking empty lines. He pulled up traps filled only with black weeds. Fish floated belly up in secluded waters, yet no marks appearing on their bodies. Even the frogs grew silent. Now, without fish, Elias had no income. Without income, he would lose his boat. And without the boat, he feared he would lose the thing that connected him to his grandfather. So when the silver fish entered his net, desperation spoke louder than tradition. It was no longer than his hand, its scales giving off a pale blue light, and its eyes followed him with an undeniable intelligence. Around its neck rested a strand of braided black hair tied with 3 tiny shells. Elias stared at it. The fish opened its mouth, but somewhere beneath the boat, a child began to sing. Elias should have thrown the creature back, but instead he placed it in the live well and closed the lid. The singing stopped. Knock. The boat rocked. Knock. The ripples spread across the water that had been completely still. Knock. Elias reached for the motor. Before he could pull the cord, dozens of pale lights appeared beneath him. They circled the boat slowly, turning the entire bayou blue. One by one, small faces rose to the surface. They did not break the water. They passed through it as if passing through a curtain. At the center of them stood a woman, scarcely 3 feet tall. Her copper-colored skin shimmered with patterns resembling fish scales. Her coiled hair floated above her shoulders, threaded with pearls and the bones of tiny animals. Dragonfly-like wings unfolded behind her, dripping water that vanished before touching the boat. "You have taken our daughter," she said. Elias looked toward the live well. "That's a fish." That's what your eyes were permitted to see. Behind her, the river kin gathered in silence. Some carried spears carved from bones. Others held shells glowing with green fire. Elias slowly opened the live well. The silver fish leaped out. Before striking the water, her body unfolded into that of a tiny girl. She hovered briefly above the bayou on transparent wings, then flew into the woman's arms. "I didn't hurt her," Elias said. "No," the woman answered, "but you heard the warnings and you carried her away." Elias lowered his head. "I need to know what happened to the fish." The queen of the river kin studied him. "The fish have gone into the lower water. They will not return while poison flows to their birthplace." Upstream, beyond an abandoned sawmill, a company had begun clearing land. Elias had noticed that the stained water ran after the rains, and he was convinced himself that he could not be responsible for everything. "But what can I do about that? I'm one old man with a leaking boat." The queen moved closer. "You are a man who saw, and that makes the burden yours." She offered him a small white stone, perfectly round and wet with water that never dried. "Carry this upstream. Place it where the poison enters the bayou. The hidden water will rise. What has been concealed will become visible." "And the fish?" "They will return if your people choose the river over what is killing it." Elias reached for the stone, but the queen closed her fingers. "There is a price." Of course there was. Nothing mysterious ever handed to a man his salvation without sliding the bill across the table. "What is the price?" "You may never again fish these waters." Elias stared into the darkness, his last conversation with a grandfather dead nearly 30 years. Yet beneath the boat waited an entire nation whose homes were dying. Elias accepted the stone. By sunrise, every light had disappeared. Only the sound of wings remained, moving across the cypress trees like rain. Elias never fished in the bayou again. But 3 nights later, he carried the white stone upriver and placed it inside the poison channel. By morning, black water erupted from beneath the company's property. Eventually, frogs returned to the reeds. Birds nested in the cypress hills. Silver flashes appeared among the water, and the people began fishing again. Elias kept his promise. He repaired boats instead and taught children to read the river. He taught them to release the first fish. He taught them never to whistle across still water after sundown. And he taught them that the bayou was not merely water waiting to be used. Some nights Elias sat alone on the bank. Small woven baskets would occasionally appear beside him, filled with medicinal roots, river pearls, or fish already cleaned and wrapped in broad green leaves. He never saw who brought them. But whenever the moon was hidden and the water became completely still, Elias heard tiny voices singing beneath the current. And sometimes, far out among the cypress trees, hundreds of delicate wings opened at once, catching the starlight like pieces of broken glass suspended above the water.